You've been lied to your entire life about what success actually looks like. Not the Instagram version. Not the version where someone cries on stage about gratitude and grit and waking up at 5 in the morning. The real version. The version that built empires, rewrote industries, and left bodies, sometimes metaphorically, sometimes not, in its wake. Because here is what the self-help industry will never tell you, what the motivational speakers won't put on their slides, and what the biographies bury in footnotes. The most successful people who have ever walked this planet were not nice. They were not balanced. They were not the well-adjusted, emotionally available, conflict-avoiding people we are told to admire and emulate. They were by almost every clinical and psychological measure deeply, structurally different from the average person. And those differences, they weren't bugs, they were the engine. Today we are going deep into the psychological dark side of high achievement, not to celebrate it, not to teach it, but because understanding it might be the most clarifying thing you've ever done about success, about power, and about yourself. Let's start with the trait that appears most consistently across the research on high achievers, and the one that is most consistently mistaken for confidence. Narcissism. Not the casual, colloquial kind where someone takes too many selfies. Clinical, structural narcissism. The deep, immovable belief that you are fundamentally different from other people. That the rules that apply to them don't quite apply to you. That your vision, your mission, your time, your ideas operate on a different plane of importance. Study after study on founders, CEOs, political leaders, and cultural disruptors shows a disproportionate rate of narcissistic traits compared to the general population. And here's why it works. Narcissism, in its functional form, produces a kind of immunity to the social feedback that stops most people cold. The fear of judgment, the terror of embarrassment, the crippling worry about what other people will think. These are the invisible walls that contain the ambitions of the majority. The narcissist doesn't have those walls. Or rather, they have them, but they are made of tissue paper. They pitch the idea everyone else thinks is absurd. They pursue the goal that everyone in the room has already silently decided is unrealistic. They survive the public failures that would permanently break most people, because at a fundamental level, they don't internalize criticism the way normal people do. It slides off. The belief in their own is load-bearing. It cannot be removed without the whole structure collapsing. And so they keep going past the point where rational, psychologically healthy people would have stopped. And sometimes, on the other side of that irrational persistence, is something that genuinely changes the world. But here is what we don't talk about. That same immunity to social feedback that makes narcissists unstoppable also makes them dangerous to everyone in their orbit. They cannot truly see the people around them as full human beings with equally valid inner lives. Employees become instruments. Partners become extensions of their self-image. Loyalty is valued only as long as it is useful. The moment you stop serving the narcissist's vision, you stop existing in any meaningful way in their world. The biographies of the most celebrated founders and leaders of the last century are littered with ex-partners, estranged children, betrayed co-founders, and loyal employees who gave decades of their lives and were discarded without ceremony the moment the calculus changed. We read those biographies and we circle the genius. We footnote the wreckage. The second dark trait is one that psychology has only recently begun to study seriously in the context of achievement, and it is this: a profoundly reduced capacity for guilt. Not the absence of morality, that's a common misconception. High-functioning, successful people often have strong moral codes, but those moral codes are almost always self-authored, self-referential. They are not handed down by society, absorbed from peers, or shaped by the fear of divine judgment. They are constructed internally, and they are applied selectively, with the self at the center. What this means in practice is that highly successful people can make decisions that harm others, decisions they know will harm others, and move on without the psychological weight that would paralyze most people. They restructure a company and eliminate 3,000 jobs and sleep that night. They end a friendship that has lasted 20 years because it no longer serves their trajectory and feel, within a week, mostly fine. They make a call that costs someone else enormously and file it under necessary. This is not because they are monsters. It is because their psychological architecture roots guilt differently. Where most people experience guilt as a stop signal, a neurological alarm that says you went too far, you must repair this, you must make this right. The highly successful person experiences a muted version of that signal, processes it quickly, and reclassifies it as the cost of progress. They have convinced themselves, and this is crucial, that the mission justifies the method, that what they are building is important enough that the collateral damage is not only acceptable but necessary. History validates them often enough that the belief perpetuates itself. Third, obsession operating at a level that most people would recognize as a psychological disorder if they encountered it in a clinical setting. We have romanticized obsession in our cultural narrative about success. We call it passion. We call it drive. We make documentaries about it. But strip away the mythology and look at the raw behavior, the 16-hour days sustained for years, the relationships sacrificed without real grief, the inability to be present in any moment that isn't directly related to the goal, the physical health abandoned, the hobbies discarded, the social connections maintained only instrumentally, and what you are looking at is compulsion. It is closer to addiction than to inspiration. The successful person's relationship with their work often shares the neurological fingerprint of substance dependence, escalating tolerance requiring greater and greater inputs of achievement to produce the same baseline feeling, withdrawal symptoms when separated from the work, continued engagement despite severe negative consequences in other life domains. We just don't call it a disorder because the product is socially valued. If someone told you they hadn't taken a real vacation in 11 years, that they had missed every significant event in their children's lives, that their marriage had ended because they were constitutionally incapable of being present, you would be concerned. Add the detail that they built a $3 billion company during that time, and suddenly the narrative flips. We call it dedication. We buy the book. We share the quote. Fourth dark trait, a relationship with truth that is fundamentally strategic rather than moral. Highly successful people lie. Not always in the crude, caught-on-camera way. More often in the sophisticated, structural way, the way that shapes perception, controls narrative, and manufactures reality. They are not liars in the way we typically think of liars, as people who say things they know to be false. They are something more interesting and more dangerous. They are people who have decoupled truth from its social and moral function and reattached it to utility. The question they ask is not, is this true, but does this version of reality serve what I'm trying to build? This shows up in how they pitch investors, presenting certainty where there is speculation, momentum where there is stagnation. It shows up in how they manage teams, creating urgency that is manufactured, competition that is staged, loyalty that is performed. It shows up most clearly in how they talk about themselves, constructing an origin story, a mythology, a version of their past that has been edited, compressed, and dramatized until it functions more as a brand asset than a biography. And here is the disturbing part. After years of telling the strategic version of the truth, many of them can no longer clearly locate the boundary between what actually happened and what they decided happened. The story becomes the memory. The myth becomes the man. Fifth, they are, at their core, deeply comfortable with risk in a way that has neurological roots. Research into the brain chemistry of high achievers consistently shows atypical responses in the dopaminergic system, the reward circuitry. Where most people experience risk as threat, activating the fear response and producing the physical and psychological symptoms of anxiety, the high achiever's brain responds to risk with something closer to excitement. The same stimulus, high stakes, uncertain outcome, possibility of catastrophic failure, produces different neurochemical responses in different brains. For most people, that scenario is a reason to stop. For the high achiever, it is a reason to accelerate. This is not courage in the traditional sense. Courage implies feeling the fear and acting anyway. Many highly successful people do not feel the fear in the conventional way. They feel something else where the fear should be. Something that functions more like hunger. This neurological difference means that the calibration of risk that protects most people from genuine catastrophe is simply absent in the high achiever. They will bet everything, their money, their reputation, their relationships, their health, on the thing they believe in. They will do it multiple times. They will do it after it has already failed once. The ones who are right become legends. The ones who are wrong disappear from the cultural narrative almost entirely. We study the survivors and conclude that the willingness to risk everything is a virtue. We don't run the same analysis on the ones who risked everything and lost everything, because they don't write the books and they don't give the talks and they don't become the case studies. Survivorship bias has built an entire mythology around a trait that is, statistically, as likely to destroy you as to elevate you. Sixth, a form of empathy that is highly selective, present when useful, absent when costly. This is perhaps the most complex dark trait because it complicates our simple narratives. Highly successful people are often extraordinarily good at reading people. They can walk into a room and within minutes understand who holds real power, who is insecure, who wants to be seen, who is afraid, who can be leveraged, and who should be avoided. This is a form of social intelligence that is remarkable and real, but it is not the same as empathy in the full moral sense. It is empathy deployed as a tool of assessment rather than experienced as a genuine emotional response. They understand your feelings without feeling them themselves. They can model your emotional state with high accuracy and use that model to know exactly what to say to make you trust them, follow them, give them what they need. When this skill is directed toward genuine leadership, toward building cultures, inspiring teams, connecting with audiences, it produces something that looks exactly like warmth and genuine care. And sometimes it is. But the same person who gives a speech that makes an entire auditorium feel seen and understood will, in a private meeting an hour later, make a decision that casually destroys someone's livelihood without a second thought, because the empathy was never evenly distributed. It was allocated strategically, directed at whoever was most relevant to the mission in that moment. Seventh, and perhaps the darkest of all, a willingness, sometimes an eagerness, to rewrite the ethical rules of their domain when those rules become inconvenient. Highly successful people do not tend to operate within existing frameworks. This is celebrated when it produces innovation. But what it actually reflects at the psychological level is a deep resistance to external authority, an unwillingness to accept that anyone else's definition of right or wrong, legal or illegal, acceptable or unacceptable applies to them with full force. They find the edges of the rules. They operate in the zones. They hire the lawyers and the strategists whose job is to locate the gap between what the rule says and what the rule means and build an empire in that gap. And when they can't find a gap, some of them simply move forward anyway and deal with the consequences later, calculating, correctly or incorrectly, that the penalty, if it ever comes, will be smaller than the gain. The word for this in psychology is low constraint, a reduced internal experience of being bound by external limits. In its mild form, it produces the entrepreneur who disrupts a stagnant industry. In its extreme form, it produces the fraudster who destroys thousands of lives while genuinely believing, at some level, that they were building something important. Now here is where this gets complicated and where the honest conversation has to go. These traits are real. They are documented. They appear in the research with a consistency that is impossible to dismiss. But correlation is not causation, and survivorship is not validation. For every person with these traits who built something extraordinary, there are hundreds with the same traits who simply caused damage to their companies, their families, their industries, and themselves, and vanished into obscurity or infamy. The traits don't guarantee success. They guarantee intensity. They guarantee an amplification of whatever direction the person points themselves in. In the presence of genuine talent, genuine vision, and a degree of luck that is almost never adequately acknowledged, these traits can produce something remarkable. Without those conditions, they produce wreckage at scale. And here is the final thing, the thing that the dark psychology conversation almost never reaches, because it is easier to either celebrate these traits or condemn them than to sit with the genuine discomfort of the truth. Most people who possess these traits are not happy. The narcissism that makes you immune to criticism also makes genuine intimacy almost impossible, because genuine intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires the ability to admit that you might be wrong, that you might need someone, that you are not actually different from everyone else. The reduced capacity for guilt that allows you to make the hard call also means you cannot fully receive love, because love, at its core, is a form of being truly seen, and being truly seen requires being known, and being known means letting someone get close enough to see the wreckage behind the trophy wall. The obsession that builds empires empties everything else. The risk tolerance that produces the billion-dollar bet also produces the fourth marriage, the estranged adult children, the birthday parties attended via video call from a different time zone. The strategic relationship with truth means you eventually cannot fully trust your own memory of your own life. We study these people. We name buildings after them. We read their biographies and take notes. We buy their frameworks and adopt their habits and try to reverse engineer the output without understanding the input. And the input, when you look at it clearly, when you refuse to sanitize it or mythologize it, is this: a particular configuration of psychological traits that makes a certain kind of extraordinary achievement possible, and makes a certain kind of ordinary human happiness, the kind built on connection and presence and genuine peace, nearly impossible to sustain. That is the trade. It is not always chosen consciously. Often it is simply the shape of a person baked in early, reinforced by early environments, calcified by early success. But it is always a trade. The most successful people who have ever lived got what they built. They just rarely got to fully enjoy it. And almost none of them, if you strip away the mythology and read the private letters, the deathbed interviews, the accounts of the people who actually knew them, would tell you honestly that it was worth it. They would tell you it was inevitable. They would tell you they couldn't have done it any other way, but worth it. That answer, when you find it, is almost always quieter and darker than the biography suggests. That is the real dark trait of highly successful people, not the narcissism, not the obsession, not the risk tolerance or the selective empathy or the strategic relationship with truth. The darkest trait is this: they could see exactly where they were going, and they went there anyway.